I've concluded over the years that he was taken out had to do with a whole other set of values and a whole other orientation. It had to do with his commitment to the poor people of this republic. He had to commit himself to the redistribution of wealth, the reallocation of resources, so that the wretched of America would have a chance to live. Black, white, Indian, whatever ethnic background, whatever racial background, whatever geographical area, he was trying to forge that alliance. And that was what was critical. He was getting involved now in human rights issues that spanned the entire globe. He was no longer a civil rights leader. He was now a human rights advocate and a prophet. He had been moved by the wretched situation of the poor in India in 1960. He carried that with him, and now he was determined to do something about that in his native land. That was the ultimate goal. It was no good to have all these civil rights, you know. You could go to any restaurant you wanted to and eat in any restaurant you wanted to and go to any hotel you wanted to. What good was that kind of right if you couldn't afford it? That was the point. So you had to enable people to enable themselves to be able to afford it. And that required assistance from government. That required the restoration of programs that had been taken away and denied because of the war. So there was the grand project. He was going to bring masses of people to the nation's capital, and they were going to camp there. Not march, camp. They were going to live in a tent city in the shadow of the Washington Memorial for as long as it took. They were going to go up the hill, visit their congressmen, their senators, and try to get these programs restored and try to get these funds placed back into the use of the people. That was the plan. That was the second reason why he was killed. Because the army believed he would not be successful. They believed that the angry mob of wretchedly poor people would get angrier, and they would get it beyond the control of this nonviolent, peaceful leader. And they would be taken over by militants who would lead a revolutionary force on the streets of the capital, the likes of which America had never seen. And America would have then its second revolution, a social revolution, for which it had been waiting for so long, for which Mr. Roosevelt had frustrated in the 30s with the New Deal programs. So they feared this would happen. Westmoreland wanted 200,000 more troops in Vietnam. They didn't have the troops for him. They didn't have the troops to put down that revolution. And because of that, Martin King was not going to be allowed to bring that mob to Washington. So those were the two reasons why he was killed. Now,
in our tradition, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. And so this morning I speak to you on this issue because I'm determined to take the gospel seriously. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. And you may not know it, my friends, but it is estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier, while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor. And much of that $53 goes for salaries to people who are not poor. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schoolroom. So we watch them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village. But we realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago or Atlanta. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
Martin King, as you know, for many years was a Baptist preacher in the southern part of this country, and he was thrust into leadership of the civil rights movement at a historic moment in the civil rights movement and social change movement in this part of the country. That's where he has been locked in time, locked in a media image, locked as an icon in the brains of the people of this country. But Martin King had moved well beyond that. When he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, he became in the mid-60s an international figure, a person of serious stature whose voice, whose opinions on other issues than just the plight of black people in the South became very significant worldwide. He commanded worldwide attention as few had before him, as a successor, if you will, to Mohandas Gandhi in terms of the movement for social change through civil disobedience. So that's where he was moving. Then in 1967, April 4, 1967, 1 year to the day before he was killed, he delivered the momentous speech at Riverside Church in New York where he opposed the war. Now,
He thought carefully about this war. He had been inclined to oppose it for quite a long period of time prior to that, 2-3 years prior to that. He had uneasy feelings. And I remember vividly, I was a journalist in Vietnam when I came back. He had asked to meet with me, and when I opened my files to him, which were devastating in terms of the effect on the civilian population of that country, he unashamedly wept. And I knew at that point, really, that the die was cast. This was in February of 1967. He was definitely going to oppose that war with every strength, every fiber in his body. And he did so. He opposed it, and from the date of the Riverside speech to the day he was killed, he never wavered in that opposition. Now, what does that mean? Is he an enemy of the state? The state regarded him as an enemy because he opposed it. But what does it really mean, his opposition? I put it to you that his opposition to that war had little to do with ideology, with capitalism or democracy. It had to do with money. It had to do with huge amounts of money that war was generating to large multinational corporations that were based in the United States. When Martin King opposed the war, when he rallied people to oppose the war, he was threatening the bottom lines of some of the largest defense contractors in this country. This was about money. When he threatened to bring that war to a close through massive popular opposition, he was threatening the bottom lines of some of the largest construction companies, one of which was in the state of Texas, that patronized the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, and that had the major construction contracts at Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. This is what Martin King was challenging. He was challenging the weapons industry, the hardware, the armaments industries, that all would lose as a result of the end of the war. Forget about democracy, forget about any ideology. This opposition to Martin King, this growing enmity to him, was based on money and the law.
America and most of its newspapers applauded me in Montgomery, and I stood before thousands of Negroes getting ready to riot when my home was bombed, and said, "We can't do it this way." They applauded us in the sit-in movement. We nonviolently decided to sit in at lunch counters. They applauded us on the freedom rides when we accepted blows without retaliation. Oh, the press was so noble in its applause and so noble in its praise when I was saying, "Be nonviolent toward Bull Connor." There's something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. There's something wrong with that press.
The second aspect of his work that also dealt with money, that caused a great deal of consternation in the circles of power in this land, had to do with his commitment to take a massive group of people to Washington and there to encamp them in the shadow of the Washington Memorial for as long as it took. For as long as it took, they would make daily trips to the halls of Congress, and they would try to compel the Congress to act as they had previously acted in terms of civil rights legislation, now to act in terms of social legislation, now to begin to talk about a redistribution of wealth. In this, the wealthiest country in the world, that had such a large group of poor people, of people living then and now in poverty.